So first of all, thank you to all of you for being here today. A huge welcome. I'm Tara Moran, CEO of the California Water Data Consortium. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the consortium, we were founded in 2019 to support implementation of the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, sometimes referred to as AB 1755. And that really is the vision for the consortium, which is active involvement from state agencies, NGOs, private sector, tribes, academia, and many others to support the development and of improved access to high quality, trusted water data to support better outcomes for everyone living and working in California. But I want to be really clear that it's about more than just high quality data. As many of you know, data has been used in the past and often continues to be used to the benefit of those that hold and interpret the data. And so part of AB 1755 is about making data more accessible to a broader community. And it's incumbent on all of us who collect and interpret data to think about how those data were collected, what motivated their collection, who's represented or not in its collection, the methods used, and many other factors that impact equity of those data long term. So I'm really excited to have Heather Krause here from We All Count, who's going to walk us through their data equity framework, which is a concrete tool that we as data users and providers can use to combat issues of bias and facilitate equity in our own work. And so I'm going to hand things over to Mike Antos in just a second to formally introduce Heather. But before I do so, just a couple of items. I firstly want to say thank you to Amanda Miller, our programs operations manager at the consortium, who is really the person that makes these events happen. If you have suggestions for other Data for Lunch topics, please reach out to either Amanda or myself. And Amanda's going to drop both my email and hers into the chat. Also, I would encourage you to follow us on Twitter or subscribe to our listserv to get information about upcoming events and news from the consortium. And we'll also go ahead and drop a link to the consortium's website in the chat where you can do both of those things. And then how today will sort of proceed is I will hand things over to Mike, who will formally introduce Heather. She'll give sort of a half-hour presentation. After that, we'll have time for questions that Mike and I will be moderating. So if you have questions, please either drop them into the chat and please include your name and affiliation. Or if you're comfortable doing so, please raise your electronic hand, which you can do at the base of your Zoom screen and in the reactions. And we'll go ahead and be able to unmute yourself at that point in time and ask your question verbally. Similar to our last couple of events, Heather has graciously agreed to stay on for informal discussion between 1 and 1:30. And so with that, I'm going to hand things over to Mike, who is one of the consortium steering committee co-chairs and a senior integrated water manager specialist with Stantec Consulting and a visiting scholar at UC Irvine. So I just want to say thank you to Mike, who continues to push the consortium to think more about equity and how to incorporate sort of and take meaningful steps in our work. So really pleased to have him co-facilitating this conversation with me. So over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Tara. I appreciate it. I normally have to explain who I am first, but you did it for me. One of my business cards says watershed social scientist, and I really find that more and more that's the role that I play in the collaboratives that I'm part of, is trying to bring the social sciences and the questions of humans and human relationships into the work that we do. Almost all of us exist inside countless relationships in our work. And we often treat them like they're just a thing that we all know how to do because we're humans. But in fact, there's a lot of sophistication to the way that we can become better at those relationships. And the moment which many of us are, approaching in new ways of expressing the questions of equity and inequity that exist in our systems and the biases that we hold through no fault of our own that influence the way that we do our work and how our work is experienced by others is something that a lot of us are working with. And I'm just super excited that this is the conversation that the Water Data Consortium brought forward today. So with that, I'm going to get it over to Heather. And what's really fun about Heather on the website for the organization that she leads, she has two bios. One is a formal one, and I'm going to ignore it like she suggests I should do. And I'll just do the informal side. So she doesn't put much stock in degrees and institutions, and Tara did that work for me, so I didn't do it either. And the thing that Heather likes to say about herself on the web is that she really, really cares about data, and she really, really cares about people, which I think makes me really excited to hear what she's ready to share with us today. So Heather, the stage is yours. I will stop sharing the screen and we can get your slides up and take it from here. Heather, welcome.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for having me and that lovely introduction. I'll apologize right off the top for not being on video. I am in rural Ontario, Canada today, and the Wi-Fi is not as good as we had thought. so we can share the slides or my face, but not both. So we're going to share the slides. And yeah, I'm so excited to be joining you for your data and lunch today, and very much aligned with Mike, what you were saying about the idea that data is not value free, that it just doesn't work like that. And the sooner we kind of get past the idea, the better off we're all going to be, both environmentally, socially, politically, financially. Absolutely, hands down, the worst equity problem that is facing data science right now is that people are making all kinds of prejudiced choices and they don't know that they're doing it. And excuse me. The reason that we really like the idea of using data in the mission-driven sector is because we want to have believable, trustworthy, reliable results that also don't include bias, prejudice, and injustice. And we're hoping that quantitative data in specific is kind of the silver bullet for this desire of ours. And we have good news and bad news about that. The good news is that when you're working with quantitative data, you have a lot of choices. There's a lot of power embedded in work with quantitative data. And let's just look really quickly at an example of the kind of choices and power that we have anytime we're using quantitative data. So here's 3 classrooms. Classroom A has 3 students in it. Classroom B has 6 students in it. And classroom C has 9 students in it. Ask yourself, what is the average number of students across these 3 classrooms? Pretty simple math problem. This is quantitative data. We're going to try and get a result. And if you say that the average classroom size in this school is 6, you are correct. And if you say that the average classroom size in this school is 7, you are also correct. That's because you can use basic math to take an average of this classroom from 2 different perspectives. Whose lived experience you embed in this math problem determines what answer you get. If you take the average number of students across these 3 classrooms from the point of view of the teacher, you will get 6 students per class. You'll ask this teacher, how many students are in your classroom? That teacher will say 3. You'll ask this teacher, how many students are in your classroom? That teacher will say 6. You'll ask this teacher, how many students are in your classroom? And that teacher will say 9. You'll add up the 3, 6, and 9, divide by the 3 perspectives, and you'll get 6. However, say you're doing educational research, say you're interested in getting the answer to this question from the lived experience of the students. So you go to classroom A and you ask the student, how many students are in your classroom? That student says there are 3. And you ask this student, how many students are in your classroom? And that student also says 3. Then you get to the 3rd student in that classroom and they also say 3. Then you go to classroom B and you go to that student and say, how many students are in your classroom? First student in classroom B says there are 6 students in my classroom. The second student in classroom B says there are 6 students in my classroom. The 3rd student in classroom B says there are 6 students in my classroom. All along the way until we get to classroom C, where we go to the first student and say, how many students are in your classroom? And that student says there are 9. And Each of the subsequent students also say there are 9 students in my classroom. We take an average in the same way that we did from the teacher's perspective. We're just using data from the student's perspective. We add up all the responses. We get 126. We divide by the number of perspectives that we're embedding in this average, and we get 7. So, to the very simple question, what is the average classroom size in this school? There are 2 correct answers. 6 from the teacher's perspective, 7 from the student's perspective. And this is true because all data and mathematics has a lived experience embedded into it. And the good news is that you, if you're working with data, have the opportunity to make that choice. You have the opportunity to decide what choice you want to embed in the way that you work with data. And let's look at another example of how choices get embedded in the results and the interpretation of data, not just the calculations of data. So we were working with a local government that was trying to support their constituents with an initiative to help people make their way out of poverty. And they wanted to know, was their project a success? So we collected some data from the people and made a nice chart that showed that before the project, the average monthly income was $800. After the project, the average monthly income was $1,300. This project looked like a success. However, we were living and working in the community where this project was happening. And so we were aware that there were 3 distinct zip codes in this project. And we had the zip code information in our data, and we could absolutely break that out. And when you use this same data to create this chart where there's one distinct line for each zip code, you can see that if you're in zip code number 1, this purple zip code, this project worked great for you. You have come close to doubling your income. If you're in zip code 2, it kind of worked. And if you're in the blue zip code 3, this project didn't work for you at all. And then there's a third way that we can view this data rather than from the perspective of average income or income by zip code. We can look at the income inequality gap. And we can see that before our project, the income inequality gap was $200 a month. And after, the income inequality gap was $1,100 a month. So we can use the very same data and 3 very mathematically reliable techniques to determine if our project is a success from 3 very different perspectives. Yes, it was a huge success. Average monthly income went up. It was kind of a success for some people, but not really for others. Or it was a huge disaster and it exacerbated income inequality greatly. And that is a choice that gets embedded into the way that we collect, analyze, and communicate that data that absolutely has worldviews and values embedded into it. And it's not just a math problem. It's a human problem too, because more and more we're seeing people that live in the blue zip code in our example, looking at data that they contributed that doesn't reflect their lived experience at all. You can use data to elevate a lived experience or to suppress and hide a lived experience. And the good news is that you have that choice. We want to think of using data science like this, where we kind of choose, we make one choice. What questions should we ask? And we go from that question to objective data, objective analysis, objective results, and an objective decision. That's kind of the fairy tale about objective quantitative data science. This is really what data science looks like in the real world. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of choices made all along the data creation and evidence building pipeline. And each one of those choices embeds a lived experience, a set of priorities, and a system of values. And so you can interpret that like bad news, not like good news. You get to make a choice every time you work with data. It can kind of feel like bad news. You have to make a choice. There's no way to go back and believe that, well, all quantitative data is value neutral. Data doesn't lie as long as it's a table. But you now absolutely have to make choices every time you're working with data, whether it's producing evidence or just making decisions based on other people's evidence. And one of the issues when we're trying to embed equity in the way that we use data is we kind of revert back to trying to find like the one objective correct choice. And that is the old paradigm that doesn't work. And that there's no checkbox of like, yes, we've achieved equity. We just keep having to improve the choices that we're making when we're using data. And this can be very straightforward, or it can be very, very complex. One of the projects that we were doing was to partner with a group that was trying to figure out how to get more milk out of the cows that were owned by a group of women in rural Bangladesh. And we really wanted to kind of build an equitable model and understand what we were doing. And we were aware that there was a lot of time use pressure in these rural villages in Bangladesh. And part of what we were doing was partnering with an organization that was offering trainings about how to take care of cows and things like that to these women. And we were asking them to kind of spend time on these trainings. So we didn't want to penalize the women for that. So we collected data very carefully on how they were using their time. And we put that into the model as a confounder variable and found out that the project was working great. The project was a huge success. The women that were involved in the training were getting like twice as much milk from their cows. Unfortunately, the women didn't feel the same way at all. The women did not like this new training program. And one of the reasons they did not like this new training program is that they were saying that it was the new kind of ways of working with the cows that they were being taught were causing them to work twice as hard, spend twice as much time with their cows as they had before. So what our model had accidentally done in the way that we built it, because we use time as a confounder, which is a technical term. If you don't know what that means, it doesn't matter for this example. It just means that the way that we built our model hid the fact that if you spend twice as much time working with your cows, you might get twice as much product. So we were correct in our understanding that time use was going to be important, but we were incorrect in how we built the model. The first model that we built wasn't wrong, but it centered our lived experience as external researchers. The second model we built centered the lived experience of the women who were taking the trainings and who were working with the cows, and controlled for time spent as a mediator variable instead of a confounder variable. Again, the technicalities of that don't matter. What matters is that the way that you build a statistical model very much always reflects a lived experience. And you can't judge that mathematically. You can't use math to find out kind of what is the most equitable model, or which model centers the lived experience, which model is the best for this situation. Math won't tell you that. Only attention to whose lived experience is being centered in the way that we're building this map can tell you when you're reaching an equitable model. Because in this example, we got two totally different answers, even though we were using the same data, same research questions, same methodology, same analysts, even controlling for the same variables, just controlling for them in different mathematical ways. So even the most nuanced choices that we make in choosing data questions, collecting data, analyzing data, have huge impacts on whose worldview is getting embedded and how those worldviews affect what happens in our world. So I kind of said this was bad news, but really it is not. It is good news, because if you are working with data, the idea that data isn't neutral, isn't without values or embedded worldviews means that you can, every time you work with data, actually harness that characteristic of data to embed the lived experiences and make the equity choices that you want. And this can take a lot of courage. And it requires researchers and data scientists and data analysts and policymakers to be much more vulnerable than we're often accustomed to in the kind of academic, scientific data world. But it's really not a choice that's going to be there very much longer. Thanks to a bunch of the pandemic, a bunch of recent political events in the past 10 years, the way that big tech is mishandling or handling data, depending on your perspective. The idea that data science is objective is going away, and the demands for data equity are absolutely growing in a groundswell. And this is, again, a really good thing, because it's going to allow you to make the choices that you want to make with data. It's going to allow us to pierce through this myth that we can only do certain conventions, certain recipes with data because they're like the one true mathematical option, to realize that we actually have lots of options, especially when we're talking about data that's going to impact people. A lot of the conventions aren't great. We're working with a couple of food banks in the United States right now. And of course, during COVID, they're in high demand. And they're doing effectiveness surveys to see how effectively they're getting their food out. And they have, okay, they have information from white clients, Black clients, and American Indian clients. They have a lot of information from white clients, a medium amount of information from American Indian clients, and a small amount of information from American Indian clients. And the habit, the convention is to say things like, we have only a small amount of data from American Indian clients, their results are not statistically significant. This is not a good choice either mathematically or humanly, because A, there's no test for the statistical significance of a sample size, and B, to say that a group of people are not statistically significant because they are a small group of people is, in a data-driven world, almost saying like they don't count or we can't count them. Instead, we need to actually say our results contain uncertainty, and our results contain uncertainty because of the design choices that we as researchers made, not because of the choices that a small group of people made. So when it's time to actually work with the data that you're working with, make the choices that you want to make for data equity, the tools that my team is working with, we all count, is called the Data Equity Framework. And we've designed this and tested this over the past number of years, really to help you avoid overwhelm and to help you deal with the fact that so much of what you've been taught to do might not serve you that well anymore. And instead, you might want to work through these 7 steps just to check your data for equity. And there's 7 specific steps in the data equity framework: funding, motivation, project design, data collection and sourcing, analysis, interpretation, and communication. And we're pretty sure that these 7 steps are present in any project that we've come across so far having to do with data. That's true of academic, scientific research, that's true of financial research, that's true of USAID and big United Nations projects, zoos, animal shelters, large universities, small school boards. The wording of these 7 steps changes, but the actual content and the concepts doesn't really change. And we often talk about them in the order of a kind of data lifecycle, but they can be done in any order. And it's not like a new recipe or list of rules that you have to follow. You can use them in any order and even just do one step or two steps as it's going to serve and support you. And I'm just going to give you a very, very quick, like 2-sentence example of what we mean by each of these 7 steps, just to kind of get your feet wet, give you an idea of what we're talking about. Then we'll open it up for questions, and you can find more information on our website and stuff like that if you're interested in diving deeper. So when we talk about funding, we're talking about the application of resources, allocation of money in terms of what even gets to count as data. And we help you understand how the combination of money, data, and influence work together to kind of set up your project for either equity success or equity failure, and how these 3 things are working together in your work. Step 2 is motivation. That's about the purpose of your data project. For example, are you collecting data on rats in New York City so that you can effectively deploy sanitation crews, or are you collecting rat data in New York City so you can do predictive policing? Very different purposes with very different equity outcomes for the same data set. Same thing for the maps that are all over our world now, in our cars, on our phones. Most of these maps are designed to get you from place A to place B in the fastest way possible. And fast is not a value that everybody has. But if we use a data product that tells us implicitly that that is the value we should have over and over and over and over again, it starts to feel like our value. But if you're willing, there's a cool thing in Boston called Happy Maps, which is a map that helps you get from point A to point B in the way that they think you will be happiest. Not that that's easy to do, but it is just an example of purpose in data and how implicit and deeply embedded it is. Step 3 is project design. You probably already know a lot about project design if you are working in research. Essentially, project design is the authorization of how you're going to do what you're going to do. For example, if you're going to use a map, whose map are you going to use? Are you going to use this map, which represents the boundaries of indigenous tribes and nations? Or are you going to use a colonial map? One is not necessarily better for the other than the other, but it's a great equity perspective in project design to think about the choices that are habitual and that we could maybe make differently. Data collection sourcing gets a lot of coverage for sure. If you're using any kind of a social construct, who gets to construct that category and who gets to sort people or things or items into that category? It's not just people. We just did a big training with zoos, and the way that animals get characterized and sorted into groups have just as big value judgments as people. Step 5 is analysis, and analysis is something we could talk about for weeks. We've already talked about my favorite example, which is the classroom size example. Even very, very basic math has value judgments in it. Interpretation, I saw was mentioned as we started this data lunch, and interpretation is, of course, a giant privilege. If you get to make meaning from the results of some data, then you are in probably one of the most powerful positions. Interpretation can go very badly wrong. For example, there's an algorithm called the compass algorithm that produces a number, and it's often interpreted as a number that predicts how likely it is that this person will reoffend. And this number is used in jurisdictions in the United States to decide bail and parole and things like that. That is a very, very bad interpretation of what actually this number can tell us. The correct interpretation is actually that this number predicts not how likely it is this person will reoffend, but how likely it is that this person might be in contact with the police again, be arrested by those police, and not have the money for immediate bail release. So that's just a quick example of the power of an interpretation and how careful we need to be about whose worldview is embedded in any interpretation that we're going to make a decision on. Finally, communication and distribution is pretty widely recognized as a place where we all, myself very much included, can improve in terms of what words we use, what mediums we use, and what data viz we use. How we show things is not in any way culturally neutral. The idea that there are these data visualization best practices, from how to make a map to how to make a bar chart to how not to make a pie chart. There's a lot of rules and regulations out there, especially in the United States and Canada. But those best practices are in no way culturally universal. They are very, very context specific, training specific, and audience specific. So if you want to embed equity in your communications, it's much better, rather than to kind of cling to a set of rules or best practices, but to develop a way to understand what your audience actually uses data for, how they want to use that data, and what colors and shapes and axes and dimensions actually mean to your audience, rather than relying on some external list of rules. Okay, so I'm just going to leave you, because I know this can be very overwhelming, especially for the amount of time that we have together. So I'm going to leave you with just a couple of basic takeaways. The first is that you can recognize that you are making subjective human choices every single day in our data work. The more everybody can pierce through this myth that, you know, math doesn't lie, and realize that we are making choices, and then consciously identify these choices in the data process. Get familiar with all the times that you or your team are making these choices. And then third is probably the most important. Now that you're aware that you're making choices, learn how to make the choices to reflect the equity that you want to see. Take advantage of the fact that all of our data science has worldviews embedded into them, and embed the worldviews that you're trying to center. Fourth, one of the effective ways to do this is expand the group of people who get to make these choices. Fifth, talk about our data choices, make them transparent, be willing to stand by them. And then last, be ready to make even better choices next time. Equity is not static. You're never going to check a box and get to equity. Instead, it's a series of small, sustainable successes moving us in the direction that we are trying to go. So again, it can be rattling or unpleasant at the very first part of your experience of figuring out that data and research do reflect values, and that's true from the way that a research question is crafted to the way the research is interpreted and everything in between. Kind of bad news, the objectivity isn't what you thought it was, but really much more good news, because it means that you can choose equity. And on that note, I will just tell you where you can find me if you want to hear more information, or if you really just want to read more people's opinions, look at some tools and stuff. WeAllCount.com is the main hub for WeAllCount, which is the Project for Equity in Data Science. And it was founded by me a number of years ago. It really has become a genuine community project of people developing and sharing tools and case studies across the world. And yeah, we would just love to hear your specific viewpoints and your contributions to the kind of quest for equity in all things data. And hello at WeAllCount.com is kind of the team inbox. We're a tiny, tiny team. Because we aren't funded or associated with any institution so that we can continue to say whatever we want to say, to be frank. And I think we have left time for questions. Yes, we have. So I will stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how. This, here we go. My internet is being very, very uncooperative.
Thank you so much for that, Heather. Really appreciate you being here today.
Yeah.
So I'm going to encourage people to either drop questions that they have in the chat, or if you want to raise your electronic hand, again, you could do so at the base of your Zoom screen under reactions. One of the questions that I had, Heather, is you kind of touched on, I think, two separate issues that I wanted to just hear more of your thoughts on. The first is the idea of data aggregation and what that can do to sort of mask these nuances that are often present in data and in some ways misrepresent outcomes and the like. And then the second is around the role of qualitative data in sort of understanding these other perspectives and bringing those out within the data that you're interpreting. And I am curious if you often do that. And I was thinking of that sort of as you talked about the milk, the milk in Bangladesh example, and sort of part of that reframing was, it sounded like through interviews and the like. So curious if that's something that you do as standard practice as you're sort of interpreting data sets and the like.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. Great questions. I'll start with the first one because I think it's easiest, and that is qualitative data is incredibly important. If we really think carefully, like if you ask somebody to say, what's the difference between qualitative data and quantitative data? Somebody on the street, they're going to say quantitative data is objective, qualitative data is subjective, which of course is not a distinction I believe in at all. I do think there are differences between quantitative data and qualitative data, but I don't think that one is objective and one is subjective is the difference. So yes, short answer is yes, we very much believe in qualitative data. I am in no way, I am a mathematical statistician. I know how to work with quantitative data. I am not an expert in qualitative data. Nobody at Wheel Count is an expert at qualitative data, largely because there are people who are experts at qualitative data usually don't need to talk about equity because they already understand that everything is situational. But we do recommend that you work very closely with people who are good at qualitative data. Having said that, the Bangladesh example with those two models, it is true that what brought me the insight about the difference between those two models was talking to people. However, that distinction could have been achieved by simply looking at the data and thinking about it. You don't actually need to talk to anybody to understand the power implications and the social balance implications of whether something is in a model as a mediator, a moderator, or a confounder. But it's a lot easier if you do want to talk to people. Same thing with the average classroom size. I walk through that math in a way that illustrates asking the teachers and the students, but you could actually do either one of those calculations with just an administrative data set and never speak to a teacher or a student. So I illustrate it in a way as if we're speaking to those teachers and students, but you wouldn't meet. So that's my answer to the first question. The second question about aggregation is such a huge question. Like, disaggregation and aggregation of data is one of the most useful and most also harmful things that we do. Because anytime that we're aggregating data, whether it's about people or ponds or giraffes at the zoo, we are imposing a concept of how the world works. And it's really important to do that mindfully, and probably B, even more important, interpret it accurately. I have another funny example where we use real data to show that smoking smoking 4 cigarettes a year adds 10 years to your life, which is real data and real analysis. But of course, it's at the country level, not at the human level. Humans that smoke 4 cigarettes a day don't have 10 years of life, but countries do, and that's because countries that have more cigarette smoking are rich. But that is hidden when you aggregate it. Somebody is asking me in the chat, it's a direct message just to me, whether the rat situation was real. Yes, that rat situation was real. New York City Public Housing collected crowdsourced. It's so bad what they did. They crowdsourced rat sighting data in their public housing. I don't know if it's called public housing in New York, but whatever the equivalent is, to help effectively deploy sanitation workers. And then the police just took it, like without even the permission of the people who had crowdsourced. And then they started using blockers and
Heather, we have another question in the chat, and it's from Deb Agarwal. Deb, do you want to unmute yourself and ask that, or do you want me to just read it?
Sure, I can unmute. So, I'm often collecting data or using data that people have collected, and I always find it challenging to figure out whether the data is biased and whether the analysis is equitable. And a lot of your anecdotes, I mean, they kind of feel like luck when you figure out that in fact there was a different answer. So do you have a systematic way of going about trying to figure that out, that there's an inequity potentially in the data collection or in the analysis?
Yes, great question. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen again and back up a bit. And yes, we absolutely have a system, and that system is right here. That system is the 7-step data equity framework. When you say, you wonder if the data that you're using is biased and the analysis you're using is equitable, the answer to the first is always yes, and the answer to the second is always no. Like all data and all analysis is biased. It's unavoidable. And so all you can do is 2 things. Become aware of what biases have been embedded into both the data and analysis. And in the places where we have scope, or where we're actively working to not correct those biases, to make choices to embed bias that aligns with your equity goals. So we're throwing out the idea that we're going to achieve objective science, simply not possible. And we're instead pivoting to the idea that we're going to adopt transparent, accountable, and purposeful science, which, just as an added side bonus, is also more accurate and more usable science. And the framework that we use to accomplish this is what's on my screen now, the 7-step data equity framework. And each of these 7 steps, I absolutely did just give you examples and case studies, because that's all I have time for. But each one of these steps has a specific set of tools and checklists and processes that you can use to understand what choices are being made at each of these 7 steps, and figure out if those choices embed the bias that you are trying to align with and amplify, or if you'd like to make changes and embed different perspectives. Now I will do my best to stop sharing with my uncooperative internet. There we go. Yeah, good question.
Thanks, Heather. This is Mike. I really enjoyed the talk. And I guess a question I'd like to see or hear what you'd like to contribute about it is there's currently an affect for data-driven decision-making. And it always makes me think of the Matrix, where like the world is actually just a whole bunch of glittering data falling past us. And if we were only able to pull out the meaningful parts, we'd be able to make all the right choices. And I'm curious, your data framework seems very much aligned with those who are practitioners of data management and data analysis. I'm curious how you communicate this same message to decision makers who are turning to the data folks for answers and help them understand that request is actually potentially introducing some of these challenges that you've showed us.
Yeah, super good point, Mike. And that is actually how We All Count got started, is kind of three points of leverage. I mean, because I think data decision making is a good part of the ecosystem. I don't think it should be the only part, but I do think that data used correctly and embedded with equity could help us kind of see beyond our limited human experiences and make better choices. But I think, unfortunately, most of the current professional development doesn't actually teach you how to do that. They're trying, the impulse is there, but we haven't quite achieved it yet. And I think the 3 points of leverage to achieve that are A, as you say, practitioners to be more aware of the ethical and equitable impacts of what they're doing, like what they're doing mathematically, not just like, you know, algorithmic fairness and stuff, but like the way you take an average has an opinion. And then secondly, get those decision makers to be able to communicate to their data teams what it is they want. Like I spent a lot of time working in governments where like the Department of Housing will say, you know, well, we need an algorithm that'll help us distribute public housing more effectively. Dear data team, please make this algorithm not racist. That's like totally not going to work. And so we're trying to kind of teach some of the kind of social advocacy and humanitarian and liberal arts ideas to the data folks, and teach just enough of the data ideas to the kind of decision maker folks that they can have a conversation. That instead of turning to your data team and saying, I'd like a housing algorithm that's not racist, they can actually, we now, you know, legislators that can turn to their data team and say, did you use race in this algorithm as a confounder or a mediator? And what are the human implications of that? And it's actually quite doable. So yeah, we work this 7-step framework in both directions to kind of bridge that gap. Because having only one of those sides working towards equity and the other is a nice idea, but very practical.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, somebody in the chat is talking about the Ethics Toolkit. And there are tons and tons and tons of kind of high-end data science toolkits out there. And some of them are great and some of them are not. And they're different a little bit than what we're trying to do, in that we are generally not working with high-end machine learning computer scientists. We're more working in the mission-driven sector, academics, government analysts, people, big tech, like people at Airbnb and stuff, but not the people building the algorithms, but people deploying the products. But yeah, there's probably 40 different AI frameworks there, which is great because we really, really need it.
Thank you. And there's a question here from Alan Chapman. And Alan, I'll go ahead and read it, but if you want to jump on at all and correct me, or if I get anything wrong, please feel free. So Alan is asking about, it seems like this procedure is actually relevant for detecting bias more broadly, and that part of what you're getting at is trying to understand exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish, and having equity as a component within that, but also more broadly, like what are the questions we're actually trying to get to?
Yes, absolutely. This is thank you for asking this question, because in our longer kind of 8-hour workshops where we walk you through the tools and stuff, one of the last things we do is we kind of go through some kind of talk to your boss, talk to your colleagues role playing of like, okay, now that you might want to use these tools, how are you going to justify it? And it starts with that, is that this framework does produce more equitable science, but it also produces better science. If you don't care about equity at all, and you just get a better answer, I mean, if we just take the average classroom size example, the difference between what is the average classroom size and what is the average classroom size from a specific perspective is just a plain old better scientific research question, even if you don't care at all about equity. So absolutely, I would totally agree that, yes. I don't think it's a question. I think it's a statement, and I agree with the statement.
Great. Are there other questions? Got one here from Jonathan Krause. Jonathan, do you want to, I can go ahead and read it, but he says, apologies if you already addressed this, but how do you reconcile the nuance that's needed in drawing conclusions with the desire to reduce things down to headlines and bullet points? Yes.
Well, I hear you, my friend. Yes, so that is a whole different problem. And I actually started, we all count, when I was a full-time data scientist for a journalism organization. As this became with the rise of data journalism, this became a huge problem, is that people were doing, they were trying to address very, very complex social issues. And again, as you say, just boiling them down to the one click. And so, yeah, I think that first of all, that's probably an economic question. Like, how are we gonna tweak the economic motivations that we set up so that people are economically so consistently rewarded for that clickable headline or bullet point? That's true in science, that's true in academia, that's certainly true in journalism, absolutely true in government. So yeah, I think that that's a kind of a bigger systemic thing, but on a really small, immediate level, I do think that there are things we can do about that. And it comes down to kind of the interpretation phase of the project. The example I used was about the compass algorithm, but there are a lot of other examples, like even the way that big media outlets talked about COVID at first, about, in the United States, Black people are more likely to get COVID. Of course, that's not true. Of course, Black people, there's nothing to do with the color of skin and your propensity to get the virus. What there is a connection between, lack of access to healthcare, lack of being in jobs that give you the privilege to stay home, and 400 years of systemic oppression that are related to getting a virus. And that's a much less sexy headline. But even if people have to click, even if you're an editor at the New York Times and it is your job that you absolutely have to boil things down into one useful headline, if you do it in conversation with other people, people that are directly affected, as you're trying to say, that's a good first start. So yeah, I hear you, and it's hard.
So I'm going to use this opportunity to just say a huge thank you to Heather Thank you for being here and helping us think through this, and thank you for all of you for being here and the great questions and the like. As I mentioned, this is going to be sort of the end of the more formal piece, but Heather has offered to stay on for a few more minutes if you do have other questions that you'd like to ask in sort of a less formal style. So thank you, Heather. And we'll transition to that. So the sort of less formal Q&A now, and people should feel free to unmute themselves and ask questions and raise hands if they prefer. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And thanks for everybody putting in the cool links. I'm clicking on them all and they're very cool. Some of them I have not seen, some of them I have. They're very cool.
So Heather, this is Mike again. I'll start off the informal section. Not long ago, I was part of a nonprofit, and we were funded to support communities trying to conserve water for drought response. So helping households learn to use less water. And we went to a local representative of a community and said, hey, we know that the low-income communities are often left out of these discussions. How can we bring the resources that are been made available to us to help your community? And her answer to us is, you're tone deaf just asking. We already use less water. We have no green space to irrigate. We have no pennies to let slip down a drain with wasted water. We're already using low water. Go look at your data again. And it really, it rattled me, woke me up to this issue. And water use and water scarcity are both things that are very much front of center in California's policy thinking and in the management moment and in new regulation. So water use, I think, is so loaded with values and inequities that are unrelated to the data, but the data is the source of so much of the decision-making about how to exert policy and programs. And I'm just curious if any of that sits in an interesting way in the way that you think, and if you have any tidbits that might help us think in more nuanced ways about all of that.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Because that's true about a lot of kind of resource and climate-based data, is that the data is, even through really, and I'm not talking about you personally or your organization at all, but just in general, is just so deeply embedded with the white gaze. And that is true of people who aren't white. So like, we work in Ghana with all kinds of resource-based data projects, but and those people that we're working with, our colleagues in Ghana, are exclusively Black and non-American, but have been taught at American universities. And so they have adopted the white male gaze, which is why it's not going to be enough to just diversify the work streams. It's not enough to just get people on our teams that have different lived experiences. I mean, not that that's great and we should do it, but it's not enough. And so that's a really cool situation. I'm glad that somebody had enough sense to actually say that. And I do think that the suggestion is correct. Like, the way that but way that we as a scientific community query data sets, and to Tara's point, the way that we aggregate those data sets probably has a lot to do with how they can be used to support or not support policy. I mean, I learned a lot about this from that income inequality thing I showed at the beginning, because we were working on a housing project and this government was trying to do all these things to kind of get income to go up, but all they were doing was exacerbating income inequality. And so what you measure as success, right? So if you're measuring something like, I'm not in any way a subject matter expert about water, but if you're measuring like water output as a success, that might be really embedded with a certain perspective. But if you were measuring like change of water or percent of water that is wasted. Again, I don't know anything about water. So, but I think that maybe looking at the outcomes and asking yourself whose definition of success is getting embedded in these outcomes is kind of what it sounds like the feedback you were getting you had to do with. That wasn't a very good answer, but it's the best I can do. Sorry.
No, it really was. I appreciate your reflections on it and the connections you made to the work you're more familiar with. It is meaningful to think about this, that not only in that housing study you represented, I think it's a neat analog to thinking about the policies that are being considered, but it's also meaningful to reflect on like water use. Household water use isn't just a measure of people's behavioral choices, right? It is embedded. Right. It is embedded with all these cultural contexts and other realities that may express inequities, and to not imagine that those are woven into that data set when it arrives at your desktop. I think it's something that I really appreciate you kind of drawing that connection for me. I hope for others too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for saying that, because even the word household is deeply embedded with bias. And what counts as a household to a well-off white person is not even the same. It's not even a class thing. I mean, it's not even if you're rich, a household is this, and if you're not rich, a household is this. It's very much what you define as success. There are, we do a lot of work with refugees, and they have the ones that we're working with here have no universal desire to kind of spread themselves out into a bunch of privately owned single family homes. That is not a definition of success. That is the definition of cultural annihilation. And so, like, when you're analyzing water use by household, what is a household and who got to decide?
That's fantastic. Meredith, you had a question in the chat. Do you want to come online and talk about it? Yeah. And I see Deb's hand too, but I think Meredith went first.
Thanks so much, Mike and Heather. Building on what you mentioned very briefly about professional development and the need for training, I was wondering what your current thinking is on timing and context for effectively introducing some of these concepts. And sort of the part B is, do you know of any examples of groups or efforts beyond your own, of course, that are doing this well or early in terms of the career trajectory of people working in this field?
Yes, great question. So there was this is so funny. There was this hilarious thing I saw on Twitter today, which was an 8-year-old had this homework, and the picture, I don't have it for a share, but it was essentially a picture. They were trying to teach them fractions. An 8-year-old is probably what, like grade 4 in the United States. And there was a picture of 4 people. And the question was, what fraction of this group of people are girls and what fraction of this group of people are boys? And this 8-year-old wrote in like hilarious pencil handwriting, I cannot tell from looking at these people who is a girl and who is a boy. So I'm going to tell you that 3/7 of these people have short hair and 4/7 of these people have long hair. And I was like, that's why I have to start teaching this, like at 8 years old. Like that kid is better than like most of the government workers that I work with. And so, yeah, I screenshotted it. I was like, it's a long weekend in Canada. I'm like, long weekend made. So I absolutely think, I mean, it's frankly, Meredith, this is a question that I ask myself a lot because we are an unfunded, very small organization. And so we're really trying to figure out where to have the biggest impact. And I really am starting to think that it has to start young. I mean, right now we're doing basically harm reduction. We're trying to work with the big foundations, the big universities, people who are currently practitioners, really to do harm reduction. But I think if we're going to see a real systemic change, it is absolutely going to have to start in elementary school. And do I know anybody that's doing that? There is somebody in Montreal, Canada, that is
kind of trying to teach about algorithmic bias to elementary schools. I don't have their information in front of me, so I can't share it, but I know that there is something in Montreal.
Thanks so much. I'll put some links in the chat as well. We're starting to see quite a bit more of the push towards early, high school, undergrad. For us at Berkeley is a huge lever with the scale and pace of things and so forth. But yeah, definitely appreciate the comments.
Yeah, Meredith, I'd love to see that. And the link that you already put in to share about the ethical, like how not to build things you will regret. I haven't seen that before, and that one I think came from you, and it's fantastic.
Like you said, there's about 40 or more frameworks and lots of debate about how to implement.
Exactly, and we can stop debating how to implement and just, I don't think that's a good use of our time.
Yeah.
There's enough room to just implement them all and get going. I just want to say that last thing about, I am very, very worried about this giant, teaching every child to code thing, because the ability to code, first of all, from a real radical point of view, is just workforce development, nothing to do with empowerment. Secondly, it's going to be one of the first jobs that's actually going to go away with artificial intelligence. We don't actually need these kids to learn how to code. We need these kids to think how to ethically understand an algorithm. But like people with a lot of, big tech companies like Google and Amazon and stuff would much rather have people who are comfortable coding than dissecting their algorithms. So if you know people who are teaching to code, little kids to code with an emphasis on ethics, other than the one in Montreal, I would very much love to meet them.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. And yeah, exactly. I know. I want Deb to be able to ask her question.
No worries. Yeah, I realize that. So actually, I wanted to say something to Mike Antos's question in your response, because we saw this happen in the water space. The last time we had California water reductions, there was this mandate of a 25% reduction, and each household was supposed to come up with a 25% reduction. And you looked at it and you'd say, so you're incentivizing that before you put this reduction in place, I should be a huge water waster because I'm already being efficient, which means you're going to penalize me for being efficient. And that's exactly roughly what happened, because anybody who'd already said, we're running out of water in California, I have to remove all my waste, was actually looking at penalties for not further reducing at that point. So yeah, we definitely have seen this exactly in place. So I guess I have another question, because not quite in the water space, but in the equity space, I mean, I've worked a lot with diversifying the workforce, for good or bad. You've pointed out some of the reasons why maybe we don't always go at it right. But one of the big challenges is whenever we collect data, trying to support figuring out, what's going on, it's almost always the case that at least one of those groups that we're trying to collect data on is such a small proportion of the population that they're personally identifiable if I even talk about anything that I learned from that population. And so what are your strategies for how you learn that information and utilize it in ways that can be conveyed without having said, oh yeah, it's John and Lisa?
Yeah, great question. First of all, though, are you in an actual donut shop or is that a background?
That's just a background. I normally bring donuts on Fridays. And now that I'm not actually in the office, I still bring the donuts. They're just lower calorie.
Okay. All right. Cool. I love it. I love that thing. Either way, that was a win-win answer. I was like, either way, this person is fantastic. Okay, so yes, this is very, very common issue. And there's, again, no perfect way, but what I usually do is when I'm in it, two different approaches. When I'm in a situation where I cannot actually say, for example, if I talk again about that income initiative and, you know, the 3 zip codes or whatever, that we're having very different experiences with that government initiative, that poverty initiative. One of the things to remember is that we do not, it is absolutely possible to present results from a subgroup of people like Indigenous people, or even specific, like I know a lot of people who are Native American don't actually like to be called Native American. They are a specific tribe, they're from a specific nation. And if we want to honor that and kind of use that in the reporting of our results, we do risk extremely problematic privacy issues. So one of the things that we do is we report the results and we say, you know, subgroup A, subgroup B, subgroup D. We don't actually say what the identities are, because in reality, what the actual identities are is not the important part. And so if I am, say, reporting those results from the food bank customer satisfaction ratings, I can say, you know, there are 12 main subgroups in this food bank satisfaction category. And the lowest satisfaction rate is a 4 out of a 1 to 10 scale, and the highest is a 6 out of a 1 to 10 scale. And there are 2 subgroups that are extremely off the mean. We're doing a really, really bad job with 2 subgroups, and we need to work on our equity issues. So that's one thing that we can do and we do it a lot in schools, a lot of times around sexual orientation, around very nuanced race and ethnicity issues. We want to say the school doesn't actually need to know whether it's this specific race of child that they're serving or underserving. All they need to know is that they are not achieving equitable results and they have to get better at it. Because realistically, very few solutions to this involve a solution that's specifically designed for a race of child or a gender identity of child. They just need to figure out how to get more equitable about what they're doing. Not a perfect solution in every situation, but that's usually what we do.
No, that's hugely helpful. Thank you. I've wrestled with this many, many times. So that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Chelsea, you still with us? Do you want to voice the comment you made in the chat here a minute ago?
I was just responding to kind of Mike's comment and the response to that just I work in with Department of Water Resources, and Mike works with us a lot. So I was just thinking, like, with this, we have like California just announced a massive water infrastructure spending bill, and and I just wonder, like, I was also thinking, like, when you're in a big time crunch like this, like we have $5.1 billion coming, like, how do you look at that data and make sure in a really fast time frame that it's going out to the right people and serving the best interests?
Thanks.
Is that a question for me?
You.
Okay, good.
Oh, no, it's more of a comment.
Okay. Okay, good.
No, this informal section here that you're starting to spark a lot of good conversation between colleagues and peers too. So it looks like Meredith is with you, Chelsea.
Well, and I will say though, I think to Chelsea's point is that trying to do things really quickly is often where we run into a lot of issues, right? And so being cognizant of that and really thinking through, are we at least putting in some measures that are protective as we try to do things really quickly? And I think it's a great point, Chelsea. So thanks for flagging it. All right. So thank you so much for being here, Heather. Thanks, everyone. Oh, Deb, it looks like you wanted to add.
Tara, I just want to say, you could see that something was wrong with the Quickly if you just looked at the COVID vaccination rates across California counties, because you could see that different counties were doing a lot better and easily. And so we've had an immediate opportunity to watch, when nobody was attempting to be biased, but you could just see the end facts say that there must have been some amount of bias in terms of the overall equity, right? So you can see that, yes, timely often is the enemy of equitable.
Well, and timely translates essentially to resources, right? So you're basically exacerbating existing equity issues by reducing things to time, which basically requires that you have capacity, resources, other pieces in place. Yeah.
Can I jump in? I know we're on
Yeah.
our way out.
Yeah.
Again,
Today's all about you, Heather, so jump right in.
A lot of this has to do with, how much you like your employment situation stuff, because I'm essentially unemployable. But what we've had good success with time, because everybody's always saying, like, we don't have enough time, is to switch the assumption. So right now, the way that most of this works is that we make the assumption that we're going to do the thing that's easiest and best for the rich white people. And we have to justify if we're going to do it any other way. And so you can put on its head and say, well, whatever, $10 million that you're getting, we're going to give that to all the indigenous people. And you have 2 weeks to justify why we're going to do anything else. Rather than, we're going to give it to the same old, and then you have 2 weeks to just say why they, again, I don't know anything about California water, so I don't know about the groups of people in Canada. Indigenous tribes and water is just a so I'm just talking about Canada here. But that's one way to put time works. If it's not carefully constructed, time and resource constraints always benefit the people with privilege. And if you have the ability to turn even the smallest thing on its head, like make time or resource benefit the least privileged, and then have the most privileged people work at making it age. Even if you can find a small place to do that, it can make such a big difference.
Yep. For every dollar we give to a well-resourced agency, they have to find a poorly resourced one to spend another $2 on. Something like that.
Precisely.
You only get a grant if you help someone else.
Exactly. Like when Michelle Obama did her giant book tour and it was really popular, she was selling at stadiums. You could only buy 3 tickets at a time, and you only got one of the 3 tickets. The other 2 tickets they gave away. You couldn't buy a single ticket. You had to buy tickets in 3s, and you only got one of the tickets. The other 2 tickets got given to Black people under the age of 18.
That's fantastic.
That's great.
Great example.
I know. So smart. So.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. This has been great.
Yeah, really, really appreciate you being here. And thank you all for the great conversation, great questions, and looking forward to thinking more about all of this.